They say history is written by the victors, but what if the victors buried more than they revealed? Beneath the ashes of a world at war lies a second battlefield, one fought in sealed vaults, forgotten bunkers, and midnight laboratories. It is a realm where paper is more dangerous than bullets, where a single misplaced file could topple empires long after the guns fall silent. In that shadowed archive, truth was never destroyed. It was hidden, redacted, and rewritten by hands, trembling not with guilt, but with calculation. Behind every triumphal speech lurked a darker ledger. Shipments that never arrived, prisoners who never stood trial, technologies that vanished without a trace. These are not stories of what was told, but of what was deliberately left unsaid. Ghosts of decisions made in smoke-filled rooms and subterranean chambers, where morality bent under the weight of necessity. And if you dare follow those threads into the labyrinth beneath official history, you may find that the real war never ended. It merely changed its name. Chapter 1: The Forgotten Convoy to Murmansk. The Arctic convoys of the Second World War remain some of the most perilous naval undertakings ever attempted. Between 1941 and 1945, Allied ships braved freezing seas, Luftwaffe bombers, and U-boat wolf packs to deliver supplies to the Soviet Union. Among them, none has been more debated than Convoy PQ-17. Official histories describe it as a disaster, with 24 of 35 merchant ships lost after Admiralty orders to scatter. Yet archival fragments and survivor testimony suggest that PQ-17 carried something far more significant than fuel and war material. Beneath its holds, concealed behind manifests listing tractors and spare parts, were containers stamped with British War Office codenames, Asset Indigo and Casket 7. The contents of those crates were never listed in post-war shipping records, and the few surviving personnel who guarded them were sworn to silence under the Official Secrets Act. The convoy departed from Hvalfjord, Iceland, on 27 June 1942, escorted by a screen of destroyers, corvettes, and anti-aircraft ships. The German threat was severe. The battleship Tirpitz loomed in Norwegian fjords, its presence forcing the Admiralty to divert heavy cruisers northward. On 4th July, the fateful order came: convoy is to scatter. It was a decision that condemned merchant ships to isolation and destruction. Pray for U-88, U-457, and other prowling submarines. Among the ships was the Paulus Hook, an American freighter that carried containers under armed Royal Marine Guard. Survivors recalled that its captain received sealed instructions before departure to be opened only in the event of imminent capture. The Paulus Hook never reached Murmansk. Officially, it was torpedoed by U-334 on 5 July and sank with all but a handful of her crew. Yet inconsistencies persist. In 1977, Soviet divers operating in the Barents Sea claimed to have located the wreck. The holds were empty, no machinery, no cargo, no trace of the sealed containers. Russian naval engineers noted cut steel beams within the holds, as if cargo had been deliberately removed before the vessel went down. The testimony was quietly published in an obscure maritime journal, only to disappear within a year. British officials dismissed the claim as Cold War disinformation. What were Asset Indigo and Casket 7? A declassified memorandum from the Ministry of Supply, dated March 1942, references indigo in connection with metallurgical compounds of high refractivity, and Casket 7 in relation to aeropropulsive experiments, priority level black. Historians speculate that these may have involved early jet engine components, advanced alloys, or radar countermeasures. Others believe they were fragments of captured German research, ferried secretly to the USSR under terms of the Anglo-Soviet Technical Exchange. If true, then PQ-17 was not simply a convoy. It was a courier of secrets meant to alter the balance of the Eastern Front. One survivor, Chief Petty Officer Leonard Hughes, gave a statement to the Imperial War Museum in 1968. He described armed Marines aboard the Paulus Hook, their weapons pointed not at the horizon, but inward toward the crew. We were told not to ask questions about the cargo. When the order to abandon ship came, those Marines were nowhere to be seen. Some of us swore the containers had already been offloaded. Hughes later recanted publicly, but his transcript remains on file. Other accounts mention a Royal Navy trawler, HMS Lord Austin, sighted near the convoy's breakup, though its presence was never recorded in Admiralty logs. Some suggest it acted as a retrieval vessel, removing priority cargo before scuttling the freighter. During the Cold War, the story resurfaced in intelligence circles. In 1958, a CIA field report from Helsinki noted Soviet inquiries into cargo lost during PQ-17. The report stated that GRU officers were particularly focused on locating indigo items. The trail grew colder in 1961 when a British Foreign Office file labelled FO 371-18241 was withdrawn from the National Archives without explanation. Requests for access remained denied on grounds of national security. The strategic implications of PQ-17's hidden cargo are profound. If advanced British technology was secretly transferred to the Soviet Union, it could explain certain leaps in Soviet radar and metallurgy observed in 1943. Conversely, if the cargo never reached Russia, then its disappearance points to an internal seizure, perhaps technology withheld for Anglo-American use after the war. The mystery is compounded by the fate of the Paulus Hook's Marines. Their service records vanish in 1942, with no burial sites or casualty lists. Inquiries by families were met with silence, the men erased as if they had never enlisted. In 1992, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a Russian naval archivist named Sergei Petrov claimed to have uncovered documents referencing the British cargo offloaded near Novaya Zemlya in July 1942. According to his account, the containers were stored briefly in Arkhangelsk before being shipped inland under NKVD guard. Petrov describes sketches of metallic cylinders, each the size of a man. Days after contacting Western researchers, Petrov was killed in a car accident. His alleged documents have never resurfaced. The Arctic seas keep their secrets well. Wreckage still lies twisted across the seafloor, but salvage efforts remain hampered by ice and depth. A joint Anglo-Russian expedition in 2001 announced plans to explore PQ-17 sites, but abruptly cancelled, citing technical difficulties. Privately, expedition members admitted their funding had been withdrawn after diplomatic pressure. Some suggest the pressure came not from Moscow, but from London. For the families of those who died, PQ-17 is remembered as a tale of sacrifice, but for those who comb through the fragments of suppressed reports and censored transcripts, it represents something else entirely. A shadow conflict hidden beneath the frozen waves. The convoy's cargo, whatever its true nature, was judged too dangerous to acknowledge even 80 years later. History books record PQ-17 as a naval disaster. The archives whisper of something stolen, concealed, and erased before it ever reached Soviet shores. What vanished in those Arctic waters remains unknown. Whether it lies buried under silt or locked within secret depots, the question continues to haunt military historians. In the silence of classified vaults, the fate of Asset Indigo and Casket 7 waits like the ice itself, cold, unyielding, and unwilling to release what it holds. Chapter 2: Operation Eclipse and the Vanishing Archives. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, the Allied plan to occupy and dismantle the remnants of the Reich unfolded under a code word that promised clarity: Operation Eclipse. It was conceived not as a battle plan, but as an administrative coup de main, a blueprint for the rapid seizure of ministries, communication centers, and archives before retreating Nazis could destroy them. Yet what unfolded across Thuringia, Saxony, and the Harz Mountains in those final days of the war suggested something far stranger. For as Allied troops moved into key government complexes, they did not find piles of burning documents, nor the chaos of abandoned offices. Instead, they found emptiness. Cabinets stripped clean, filing rooms barren, shelves swept of their contents. Whole sections of the Reich's bureaucracy had been spirited away in the final hours, leaving behind a silence more telling than fire. A diary entry by Captain James L. Wilcox of the US Third Army's G2 Intelligence Section, dated 10th May 1945, records his surprise at the eerily pristine condition of the Reich Chancellery Annex in Gotha. The papers are gone, not destroyed, removed, each drawer emptied as though by clerks working methodically under orders, he wrote. British intelligence officers moving into Kassel reported the same. Documents expected to shed light on the Reich's armaments program, foreign assets, and industrial cartels were simply not there. Interrogated Wehrmacht staff officers consistently gave the same answer: Sondergruppe Nebel. No record of Sondergruppe Nebel exists in the Wehrmacht's order of battle or SS rolls. The name appears only in fragments, scribbled in the margins of confiscated notebooks, mentioned in passing during hurried interrogations, or whispered in Soviet intelligence reports. One US Signal Corps intercept from April 1945, decoded too late to act upon, referred to Nebel units transiting Heart Zone, with convoys secured by SS elements not recognized in theater. The description suggested small mobile groups, heavily guarded, moving west with an urgency that belied the Reich's collapse. But what were they carrying? Reports from German civilians living near Nordhausen describe convoys of trucks passing through the mountain roads under cover of darkness, some towing covered rail wagons. The civilians noted insignia unlike standard SS markings, an elongated shield with a horizontal bar. None of these insignia were ever catalogued. When questioned after the war, villagers recalled armed guards with clipped foreign accents. Some claimed they were not German at all. Others insisted the convoys drove not east towards Soviet lines, but deeper west into territory, soon to be occupied by the Americans. General Omar Bradley's staff in Frankfurt drafted an internal memorandum on 12 June 1945, noting the complete absence of Reich ministry files pertaining to economic partnerships, weapons procurement, and foreign currency reserves. The memo suggested that either the documents had been destroyed by highly systematic means or removed intact by entities operating outside known chain of command. The second explanation was redacted in subsequent versions. Curiously, in August 1945, the Office of Strategic Services opened a new file, X1345, dedicated to tracing missing Reich archives. That file, too, disappeared from circulation in 1948, absorbed into the newly formed CIA's special collection under restricted access protocol. Soviet accounts tell an equally unsettling story. In 1946, NKVD reports compiled in Berlin noted the interrogation of a German archivist who had served in the Reich Economics Ministry. He claimed that in March 1945 he was ordered to pack sensitive files into wooden crates labeled only with numbers. These crates were loaded onto trucks and handed over to men in black uniforms, whose papers bore the stamp of the SS main office, but carried no signatures. He never saw the files again. When pressed, he admitted hearing the term Nebel from one of the escorts. The archivist later died in Soviet custody before further questioning. The aftermath of Operation Eclipse should have seen a comprehensive cataloguing of the Reich's secrets. Instead, Allied archives themselves began to show gaps. In the UK, several Foreign Office files concerning German industrial links and corporate contracts vanished in the late 1940s. In Washington, Treasury Department memoranda on German gold transfers abruptly ceased after May 1945, with references to missing documentation marked classified pending review. By the 1950s, the subject of vanished Reich records had become a closed door, one guarded with unusual tenacity. What exactly was spirited away during those final weeks? Some historians suggest industrial patents, banking records, and intelligence networks, assets too valuable to fall into Allied public tribunals. Others point to more ominous material, dossiers on war crimes, proof of Western corporations' collaboration with the Reich, or technical research with post-war strategic value. The secrecy surrounding Operation Paperclip and the absorption of Nazi scientists into American and Soviet programs hints at why these files may have been suppressed. If the Nebel convoys carried such knowledge, then their disappearance was no accident, but a calculated handover designed to shape the coming Cold War. The British National Archives lists multiple Eclipse-related files still withheld on national security grounds. File series WO204, 104 and 12, once catalogued as Eclipse Seizure of German Government Documents, remains closed, its review date extended repeatedly into the 21st century. Requests for declassification are routinely denied. When pressed, officials claim the documents contain sensitive intelligence methods. Yet, veterans who served in Thuringia recall that what was removed were not codes or cryptographic machines but boxes of paper that could implicate individuals and institutions long after the Reich had fallen. In 1963, during hearings on Nazi gold in the US Senate, a former Army intelligence officer mentioned in passing that entire trainloads of documentation went missing during Eclipse, particularly in the Harz sector. His statement was struck from the record. In 1979, a West German parliamentary inquiry into Nazi assets discovered a reference to Nebel files, but was denied access by NATO partners. Even in post-Cold War Europe, the story of vanished archives remains carefully obscured. The Harz Mountains, where civilians saw convoys vanish, have been the focus of occasional expeditions. In 1994, amateur historians exploring abandoned tunnels near Ilfeld found rusted file boxes marked with Reich Eagles, their contents burned or rotted. The German government confiscated the materials within weeks. Local police cited public safety, yet photographs taken before seizure showed charred fragments of economic reports dated 1944. Whether these were remnants of the Nebel consignments or unrelated debris is unknown. The deeper tunnels remain sealed under concrete. The story of Operation Eclipse is one of absence, a silence left behind where history should have been written. Victory in Europe brought celebrations, but in the shadows, truck convoys rolled, filing cabinets were emptied, and names were erased. What those files contained may never be fully known, but the fact that their disappearance continues to be protected by governments that once fought to expose Nazi crimes suggests that some truths were considered too damaging to daylight. Eclipse ended the war for Europe. For its archives, it marked only the beginning of a darkness that has never lifted. Chapter 3. The Ghost Flights of Operation Lusty. By the spring of 1945, as German cities crumbled under Allied bombardment, a parallel war unfolded in the skies. A battle not for territory, but for technology. Operation Lusty, short for Luftwaffe Secret Technology, was the codename for the US Army Air Force's campaign to capture, catalogue, and exploit the Reich's most advanced aircraft. On paper, Lusty was straightforward. German jets, rocket planes, and prototypes were to be seized and shipped to the United States for study. Yet buried within after-action reports and fragmentary airfield logs lies the shadow of something concealed. Ghost flights that never appeared in official inventories. Aircraft taken not for research but for silence. The Lechfeld Air Base near Augsburg, captured in late April 1945, became one of Lusty's most significant prizes. Here the Americans discovered the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter, the Arado R-234 jet bomber, and fragments of advanced designs that hinted at a future war already imagined by German engineers. Colonel Harold E. Watson, commander of the Watson's Whizzes technical team, organized the collection and ferrying of these aircraft to Allied airfields in France before their shipment overseas. In Watson's reports, each aircraft is logged meticulously, except for a half-dozen entries marked only with the words, "Do not inventory." Surviving pilot logbooks from the 54th Air Disarmament Squadron tell a different story. Between May and June 1945, at least 6 Arado 234 bombers were flown westward under armed escort. The logs list tail numbers but provide no destination, and the pages following each entry were torn out. Men who flew the routes recalled escorting aircraft to a separate facility beyond Le Havre, where the normal shipping manifests were replaced by sealed orders. "We were told not to ask questions," recalled Captain James R. Dilley in a 1969 oral history. Those planes weren't going to Dayton, they were going somewhere else. Rumors spread among Lusty personnel of Blacklist Item 74, a category of captured material too sensitive to be shared even within Allied circles. Unlike the Me-262s and Heinkel jet prototypes eventually displayed at Wright Field, these aircraft vanished into the desert. Pilots whispered about flights continuing beyond France, bound for transatlantic crossings to facilities never publicly acknowledged. Some suggested the destination was the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. Others pointed to Groom Lake, then only a dry Nevada basin used for bombing practice. The truth remains elusive. A declassified US Air Technical Service Command memorandum dated July 1945 notes that certain assets received from Augsburg sector have been reassigned under Directive JCS 1097, Special Handling, no further distribution. The memorandum does not specify the assets, but accompanying notes mention jet propulsion research with strategic implications. The same document refers cryptically to non-standard propulsion evaluations, a phrase absent from any other Lusty report. When researchers filed Freedom of Information requests in the 1980s, this memorandum was one of several heavily redacted, entire sections blacked out on grounds of national defense. The Soviets, too, noticed the missing aircraft. A 1947 GRU report obtained after the Cold War describes American concealment of captured Arado technology with no subsequent public testing. Soviet intelligence agents noted the absence of R-234 bombers in US exhibitions, despite evidence that multiple airframes had been seized intact. The report concluded that the Americans were withholding specific advances in jet reconnaissance and long-range bombing. Soviet engineers later attempted to replicate aspects of the Arado design, but their lack of access to complete examples hindered progress. At Lechfeld itself, local German civilians recalled the night of 12th of May 1945, when convoys of trucks removed aircraft parts under heavy guard. The vehicles bore US military markings, but were accompanied by personnel wearing no insignia. Witnesses described crates stamped with Luftwaffe eagles and others labeled in English as experimental assemblies. Some of these crates were loaded onto C-47 transports that lifted into the night. Destinations unknown. No record of these flights appears in Allied movement logs for that date. German workers pressed into labor at the airfield were released days later, told never to speak of what they saw. Even among Allied personnel, secrecy was absolute. In 1946, the War Department circulated a restricted bulletin noting unaccounted material from Lusty operations. The document was marked "For Eyes Only" and instructed recipients to destroy copies after review. Surviving fragments suggest that some aircraft were reclassified not as captured enemy property, but as strategic assets under provisional custody. Once relabeled, they disappeared into the labyrinth of American black projects. The designation ensured they would bypass normal channels of scientific exchange, never reaching civilian engineers or even many within the military. The fate of the ghost flights has remained obscured by layers of silence. Researchers attempting to track them in the post-war years found only hints. A 1952 issue of Aviation Week reported mysterious jet aircraft sighted during maneuvers in the Nevada desert, with silhouettes resembling the Arado 234. The article was swiftly retracted, and the magazine later claimed a case of mistaken identification. In the 1960s, declassified photographs of experimental reconnaissance aircraft bore uncanny similarities to German prototypes never officially imported to the United States. Whether coincidence or lineage, the echoes are difficult to ignore. Eyewitnesses to the ghost flights grew fewer with time. One of the last, Sergeant William H. Kendall, described in a 1981 interview how he guarded a hangar in Cherbourg where captured jets were held temporarily. One night, he recalled, a group of officers came with sealed orders. They loaded the jets onto trucks and drove them out. We were told to turn our backs. The next morning, the hangar was empty. When I asked where they went, my CO said, "Forget you ever saw them." Kendall's account, dismissed as anecdotal, nonetheless matches other testimonies from Lusty veterans. Historians who have pieced together fragments argue that the ghost flights reflect a larger pattern of wartime secrecy. The Allies were not only seizing German technology, they were competing to hide it from one another. What was not shared with Britain was concealed from the Soviets, and what was too dangerous for public knowledge was buried in classified vaults. In that shadow war, Operation Lusty became less about cataloguing and more about controlling who would inherit the Reich's most dangerous ideas. The 6 Arados that slipped into silence represent not just missing aircraft, but a vanishing act orchestrated to shape the balance of power in the decades to come. Today, surviving examples of the Arado 234 sit in museums, stripped of their wartime aura. Yet in the classified corridors of the Pentagon, files remain sealed that may tell a different story, one where the boundaries between captured German engineering and post-war American aerospace blurred into secrecy. The ghost flights of Operation Lusty, logged and then erased, still haunt the archival silence. They are reminders that the war did not end with surrender. For some aircraft, the runway extended into the shadows of a new age, their destinations unmarked, their existence denied, their purpose never spoken. Chapter 4: The Unfinished War in the Adriatic. When Europe celebrated the end of the Second World War in May 1945, few realized that in certain corners of the continent, the fighting never truly stopped. The Adriatic Sea, a lifeline of covert traffic during the war, became the stage for a clandestine struggle that extended into 1946 and beyond. Official records frame the region as a backwater in the aftermath, its islands handed over to Yugoslav partisans under Marshal Tito. Yet declassified fragments and survivor testimony tell another story. a secret war waged beneath the waves, where the prize was not territory, but hidden cargo scuttled by the retreating Axis. What British naval intelligence divers found in those waters was quietly buried, not in seabeds, but in archives sealed from public view. In March 1946, reports reached the Admiralty that freighters sunk near Vis Island were not ordinary blockade runners. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the Adriatic had been a conduit for German and Italian attempts to resupply garrisons and move contraband, often under the cover of civilian shipping. As the Axis collapsed, several of these ships were deliberately scuttled rather than surrendered. The assumption was that they carried food, fuel, or ammunition. But when British Special Operations Executive, SOE remnants, and Royal Navy clearance divers inspected wrecks in early April 1946, they discovered something more unsettling. Metallic crates, sealed drums, and containers marked with the Reichsadler insignia. Lieutenant Commander Arthur P. Henshaw, assigned to Naval Intelligence Division Section Thutheen, recorded in a now withdrawn report that the crates bore complex stenciling consistent with industrial shipments, though none carried standard export codes. Some containers, according to his divers, emitted a faint chemical odor, leading to fears of chemical weapons. Instead of declaring their finds to Yugoslav authorities, the British quietly recovered several crates under the cover of night and transported them aboard HMS Perseus, a submarine once used for supply runs to partisans. None of these cargoes were listed in official Admiralty shipping manifests. For local Yugoslav fighters who had spent years fighting Axis occupation, the secrecy was intolerable. Partisan records, preserved in Belgrade, describe an incident on 17th April 1946 in which a Yugoslav patrol stumbled upon a British recovery team unloading crates onto the docks at Komija. The patrol attempted to intervene but was outgunned. The subsequent report, filed by a partisan officer named Vukovic, noted that his men saw British sailors guarding barrels with German markings, refusing all explanations. Days later, Vukovic and his unit disappeared. Their file was struck from the Yugoslav archives, with only a marginal note added decades later. Incident suppressed for diplomatic reasons. The nature of the cargo remains the subject of speculation. A single fragmentary report, misfiled in the British Public Record Office as DFE 31452, references special recovery efforts, Adriatic sector, 17 April 1946. The document mentions strategic materiel, unsuitable for disclosure to Allied authorities, and orders its immediate transfer to Malta for further evaluation. Researchers who attempted to access the file in the 1990s found it withdrawn and reclassified. To this day, it is absent from open catalogues. Theories abound as to what lay in those crates. Some suggest Reichsbank reserves moved south in the war's final days, gold hidden aboard merchantmen that never reached Trieste. Others argue for chemical stockpiles, remnants of the German nerve agent program relocated from the collapsing Balkans front. A more compelling possibility points to experimental technology. In 1944, elements of the Luftwaffe's research division briefly used Croatian facilities to test radar countermeasures. If prototypes or documentation had been shipped across the Adriatic for safekeeping, their recovery would explain the extraordinary secrecy. British involvement raises further questions. Why were SOE remnants, formerly dissolved in January 1946, still operating in Yugoslavia months later? Testimony from former operatives suggests a unit codenamed ShadowNet continued maritime intelligence in the region under cover of demining operations. In practice, their task was recovery. A surviving diary of Petty Officer Colin March, smuggled to his family before his death in 1952, describes midnight dives, crates hoisted with grappling gear, and the sharp orders of men who were not Navy. March wrote bitterly that, "We were no longer clearing mines, we were thieves for someone else's war." The aftermath in Yugoslavia was fraught. Tito's government lodged quiet protests with London, accusing the British of imperialist scavenging. These were never made public, buried beneath the veneer of new alliances forming against the Soviets. Yet in the Cold War decades that followed, the Adriatic featured prominently in Soviet bloc intelligence files. A 1955 KGB memorandum described Anglo-American plundering of Axis maritime wrecks in Yugoslav waters, linking the operation to British refusals to share naval intelligence with Belgrade. The same memorandum mentioned the transfer of cargoes through Gibraltar to destinations unknown. If the crates truly contained advanced technology, they likely disappeared into the same classified labyrinth that swallowed Operation Lusty's ghost flights. Admiralty archives include tantalizing cross-references between Adriatic recoveries and Royal Aircraft Establishment reports from 1947, but the specifics remain sealed. The few pages released under the UK's 30-year rule carry only vague allusions to non-conventional guidance systems and foreign metallurgical samples. Whatever was pulled from the seabed near Vis, it was not mere scrap. By the 1960s, the events of 1946 had been largely forgotten. Local fishermen in Kamaja still told stories of foreign divers hauling crates under cover of darkness, stories dismissed as folklore. Yet occasional discoveries reignited suspicion. In 1974, a Yugoslav salvage team exploring a wreck near Hvar reportedly found corroded canisters with German markings. The site was immediately sealed by the Navy, and divers were warned under threat of imprisonment. No photographs survived, but one diver later claimed the canisters contained unfamiliar wiring and glass tubes, not munitions. The British, for their part, maintained silence. When questioned in Parliament in 1983 about post-war naval operations in the Adriatic, the Ministry of Defence insisted they had been limited to demoning. The same year, an internal review quietly extended the closure of several Admiralty files relating to 1946 by another 50 years. Even in the 21st century, requests to access these files are refused, citing sensitivity to international relations. The unfinished war in the Adriatic was not about battles fought, but about what was hidden, stolen, and erased in the months after the guns fell silent. For those who lost comrades to secret firefights, or who watched crates vanish into submarines, it was a reminder that peace was never absolute. In those dark waters, the conflict bled seamlessly into the Cold War, with secrets worth more than lives. The wrecks still lie beneath the surface, their twisted hulls rusting in silence, perhaps still holding what divers once glimpsed and what governments will never acknowledge. Chapter 5: The Erased Trials of Camp 114. In the quiet countryside of Ham, near Richmond in Surrey, a nondescript cluster of huts and wire fences once hid one of Britain's most secret post-war operations. Known blandly as Camp 114, it was officially listed as an interrogation facility for high-value German prisoners of war between 1945 and 1948. Yet, what occurred behind its guarded gates bore little resemblance to the narratives presented at Nuremberg. Instead of preparing men for trial, Camp 114 systematically decided which former Nazis would vanish into history and which would re-emerge under new identities. It was an erasure, not a reckoning, and the documents that remain, scattered transcripts, redacted memos, and missing prisoner numbers, testify to a program designed less for justice than for Cold War advantage. The camp's commandant was Colonel Robin Tin Eye Stevens, a man already notorious for running MI5's wartime interrogation center at Camp 020. Under his authority, Camp 114 processed hundreds of SS officers, industrialists, and technical specialists. Publicly, many of these men were supposed to be transferred to the London District Cage for war crimes hearings. In practice, a parallel system existed. Priority detainees, not for tribunal. These individuals were flagged in handwritten memoranda, marked with the initials PDN, and escorted to separate quarters. They were questioned at length, often at night, with transcripts typed on different paper stock than routine interviews. What made these men different was not their innocence, but the secrets they carried, secrets deemed too valuable to risk in open court. A surviving MI19 briefing sheet from October 1945 outlines the rationale. Certain detainees possess knowledge vital to the security interests of His Majesty's government and allied partners. Public prosecution would imperil sources, methods, and political arrangements. The sheet was stamped "Destroy after reading," but a carbon copy survived, misfiled among medical records. Attached was a list of names, most later absent from Nuremberg rosters. Among them was Dr. Karl-Heinz Reiner, an Ahnenerbe scientist linked to chemical weapons testing in occupied Poland. His testimony could have implicated senior Wehrmacht officials. Instead, his trail ends at Camp 114 in December 1945. No transport record exists. By 1947, a man named Karl Reiner appeared in Argentina, working under contract with a British-linked mining company. Local residents in Surrey recalled the strange movements at the camp, Lorries would arrive at night, their cargo covered, and leave before dawn. Former guards admitted under anonymity that prisoners were occasionally taken to RAF Northolt Airfield and placed aboard planes bound for destinations unrecorded in shipping logs. "We called it the Midnight Run," one recalled decades later. "Those men didn't go to trial. They went somewhere else." When pressed, he admitted he was ordered never to ask questions, under penalty of court-martial. The fear lingered even into old age. The secrecy of Camp 114 was reinforced by deliberate archival erasure. The National Archives contains only sparse references, occasional personnel rosters, requisition forms for food and clothing, nothing substantive. Files catalogued under WO208 once promised more detail, but nearly all have been retained by Department. Researchers who petitioned for access in 2003 were told that disclosure would compromise intelligence, methods still relevant today. What methods from 1946 could remain relevant, except those tied to ongoing human networks? The suspicion is unavoidable. Camp 114 was not dismantled so much as absorbed into the machinery of Cold War intelligence. Testimonies from detainees support this view. A handful who resurfaced in Germany during the 1950s admitted privately to being held in Britain but not tried. One, a Luftwaffe signals officer, later told his son that he had been offered a bargain, cooperation in exchange for resettlement. He was given new identity papers, money, and instructions never to reveal his past. When the son attempted to trace the paper trail, he found gaps where his father's wartime record should have been. The files had been pulled, leaving only a note. Removed under Directive 114.3. No such directive exists in open sources. A particularly chilling aspect of Camp 114's operations was its use of silent transcripts. Guards recalled typewriters clattering through the night, producing pages of testimony that were burned by dawn. Only sanitized summaries were placed in official files, stripped of names or implicating details. Colonel Stevens himself admitted in a post-war letter that excess detail is a liability to posterity. The implication was clear. Erasure was policy, not accident. Why were these men spared? The simplest answer lies in utility. Engineers connected to rocket propulsion, metallurgists who had worked on advanced alloys, economists who managed Reich industrial cartels, all were commodities in the coming struggle with the Soviet Union. Their crimes were inconvenient truths that could be traded for knowledge. In this sense, Camp 114 was Britain's own version of Operation Paperclip, though cloaked in even deeper secrecy. Whereas the Americans celebrated their absorption of German scientists, the British preferred silence and disappearance. Not all secrets were technical. Some detainees held political knowledge too explosive to surface. A withdrawn Foreign Office file once referenced individuals capable of testifying to commercial collusion between British firms and the Reich. If such men were placed in Nuremberg, the trials could have revealed embarrassing connections at the highest levels of British industry. Camp 114 ensured that testimony died in locked rooms. The men who could speak quietly moved beyond the reach of courts. The true number of prisoners who vanished this way is unknown. The official registry lists 390 detainees. Independent estimates suggest nearly double that number passed through its gates. In 1989, when parts of MI5's wartime archives were opened, journalists inquired about Camp 114. The Ministry of Defense denied its significance, calling it a temporary holding site. Yet photographs from local residents show a heavily fortified perimeter with searchlights and watchtowers, far more elaborate than a holding camp required. Interviews with former cooks and orderlies describe a population of serious men, officers mostly, who never mixed with the ordinary German POWs. These prisoners were housed separately, their movements tightly controlled, their names never spoken aloud. The erasure extended even to death. Families of missing officers wrote to British authorities seeking news. Many received only generic replies, no information available. A few received letters stating that their relatives died in custody, but no burial sites were given. Researchers searching cemeteries near Ham find no markers, no records of German POW graves. Where the bodies went, like where the living were sent, remains unresolved. By the late 1940s, Camp 114 was closed, its huts dismantled or repurposed. The site today shows little trace of what once occurred. Suburban housing covers much of the ground. Children play where interrogators once sat across tables under dim light. Yet the silence of archives is telling. While other interrogation camps have been documented, Camp 114 persists in a fog of absence. What little emerges suggests a systematic program of disappearance. Men whose existence was deemed too dangerous to acknowledge, whose crimes were balanced against usefulness, and whose fates were rewritten by the needs of a new war. The erased trials of Camp 114 remain one of the most unsettling shadows of the post-war era. It was here, in quiet English fields, that the line between justice and expedience blurred entirely. The men who should have stood before tribunals instead walked into the Cold War as assets, their sins scrubbed clean by silence, the records withheld, the families misled, the transcripts burned. All point to a deliberate choice. That truth was less valuable than power. In that choice, the war never ended. It simply changed rooms, changed names, and carried forward under the watchtowers of a camp the public was never meant to know. Some truths are too heavy to be spoken aloud. They linger like cold embers beneath the official record, shaping the present from the shadows of a past that never truly ended. In that darkness, the lines between hero and villain blur until they are indistinguishable, and the victors begin to resemble those they defeated. What remains are echoes, sealed files, nameless graves, erased testimonies, all whispering that history's neat conclusions are illusions meant to comfort, not to enlighten. The deeper one digs, the more unsettling the discoveries become. Alliances forged on secrets, futures built atop lies, and choices that traded justice for control. Perhaps that is why so many doors remain locked, why so many archives remain sealed, because somewhere within them lies a version of the past that could still change everything we think we know. And if those vaults were ever opened, we might discover that the most dangerous truths are not the ones we've forgotten, but the ones we were never meant to find.